Okay, so I'm going to move forward a bit and talk mostly about my area of specialization, which is the modern period, Tafsir in the modern period, and relating to the topic of this panel, which I've been asked to contribute to. I'm going to present a few thoughts on what role the emergence of the Qur'an and the early history of the Qur'an plays in modern Tafsir. But I'm going to start with a pre-modern example or some thoughts on the role of history in pre-modern Tafsir, because very often, there are these demands on the part of some Western media, scholars and so on, that Muslims finally need to do something like a historical critical interpretation of the Quran, which is a problematic demand in many ways, but I'm not going to go into that. But rather move to the counter-argument that you often hear, which is that Muslims don't need this because their tradition is already historical. Tafsir relies on hadith, it relies on asbāb al-nuzūl, the occasions of revelation, which are based in the biography of the Prophet, the Sīra. They have the concept of abrogation, naskh. They have the idea that there's a chronology in the Quran, there are Meccan and Medinan verses. And this is why there's really no need to tell Muslims they finally have to start like doing a historical interpretation of the Quran. In a way, as I said, I think the demand to finally do what the Christians did with the Bible and do a historical critical interpretation is a bit simplistic, because the transmission history of the Quran, for example, is completely different from that of the Bible. But on the other hand, this counter-argument, of course, is also a bit simplistic. Starting with the fact that there's a big gap between hermeneutical theory and what exegetes actually do in their works of tafsir. So you always have to see what do they actually do with these historical sources, and I'm going to come to that. There's also a tension between the historical chronology of the Quran and its canonical arrangement, which is what exegetes follow usually in classical works of tafsir, and also in a very atomistic way, so verse by verse or even segment for segment. And finally, the question is, do they just cite transmitted sources, or do they actually think about historical plausibility? And I really started thinking about this many years ago when I worked on the exegete Muhammad al-Shawkani, who lived in early 19th century Yemen, belonged to a group of, he was a kind of ex-Zaidi who had converted to kind of non-madhab Sunnism. I'm just going to give you one example from his tafsir that was really striking to me, because it was giving like completely new ideas that I couldn't find in any of previous works of tafsir on this particular verse, which is a verse from Surat at-Tawbah. إن الله اشترى من المؤمنين أنفسهم وأموالهم بأن لهم الجنة. So it's يقاتلون في سبيل الله and so on. So it's basically they fight in the way of God, and God bought from them, or he made a contract with them to give them Jannah in exchange for their أنفسهم and أموالهم. So practically every work of tafsir gives an occasion of revelation for this, which is the Bay'ah of al-Aqaba, which was a meeting that Muhammad had before the Hijrah with representatives of the Ansar to come to Medina in exchange for their protection, etc. And Shawkani quotes this because everybody before him does this too. And then he quotes an alternative tradition, because among his sources is the Quranic commentary by as-Suyuti called ad-Durr al-Mansur, which basically collects all the hadiths he could find on any given verse in the Quran. And Suyuti just collects them. He also, the interesting thing about him is that he collects them from a wide range of sources far beyond the conventional works of tafsir. So he also has some early collections that he draws on, for example, the tafsir of Ibn Abi Hatim. And here he has an alternative, Sabab al-Nuzūl, which is very short and just says the Prophet proclaimed this verse in the Mosque of Medina. And now Suyuti just quotes this because in his Durr al-Mansur he just collects these hadiths and doesn't comment on them at all. But Shawkani proceeds then to look at the actual Sīra. And he says, okay, what does the Sīra tell us about the Bay'ah of al-Aqaba? So we have many versions of this story which are essentially the same, but none of them ever mentions that Muhammad proclaimed a Quranic verse in this context, let alone this verse. And then he says that also the pledge of the Ansar does not contain any allusion to warfare, to any duty of the believers to kill or be killed, or the duty to sacrifice whatever their possessions or anything. And so then he concludes by saying the story of al-Aqaba contains nothing that points to its being the occasion of revelation of this verse. He doesn't just quote historical or pseudo-historical traditions from previous works of tafsir. He looks at the actual Sīra and does a plausibility check. And there are, of course, other aspects, like Surat at-Tawbah is usually taken to be one of the last revelations of the Quran, and the Bay'ah of al-Aqaba is actually before the Hijrah, so how does this fit, and so on. And so he is actually pointing to a problem with the verse that seems quite obvious, but apparently wasn't obvious to the exegetes before him. Which shows a bit where the problem with treating the asbāb al-nuzūl material as if it alone constitutes a historical source. So very often it's just part of the tafsir because it's part of the transmitted material on verses, but it's not necessarily part of doing a historical plausibility check. You occasionally find exegetes who are more interested in doing such plausibility checks than others. Ibn Kathir does it on a few occasions where others don't, not consistently, but sometimes. Ibn Atiyah sometimes does it, and these are usually exegetes who are very interested in the Sīra. So often they also have written biographical works, and so for them it's kind of the obvious step to actually wonder whether this matches the Sīra accounts. What you then can see is that Muhammad al-Shawkani's doubts about this the classical sabab al-nuzul of the verse were taken up by many exegetes in the 20th and 21st centuries who felt uncomfortable with the version of the Bay'ah of al-Aqaba because they, for many reasons, for example, because modern exegetes tended to be much more concerned with the larger context of the surah than most pre-modern exegetes were. But also because there's this marked rise in the interest in historicization of the Quran. And of course today, I mean, in the many hermeneutical theories we've seen in the last decades, history is always, a big theme. How do we deal with the history of the emergence of the Quran, the history of the first Muslims, etc. What exactly was changing and when? And so I would like to point to another case study that I have worked on at some point, and that is Muhammad Abdu, because I think that is also quite interesting and can cause us to think about what we actually mean when we say history, the role of history in the Quranic, in the interpretation of the Quran, on what different meanings this term can actually have, because there's no single meaning, I think, of what it means to apply, historical thinking to the interpretation of the Quran. So this is Quran 95, Surat at-Tin, and it has an oath in the beginning. Wat-tin wa zaytun, wat-tur sinin, wa hadha al-balad al-amin, by the fig and the olive, and the tur sinin, which is usually taken to mean Mount Sinai, and this city of security, which everybody agrees is Mecca, basically. So there are many interpretations in pre-modern works of tafsir, ranging from, okay, this is just figs and olives because they are nourishing and belong to the miracles of God's creation, etc., to reading them as allusions to certain places. And again, there are loads of different stories about what places these might be, like the place where Noah's Ark landed and whatnot. There are also some attempts, especially in periods where there was quite intense polemics between Muslims and Christians, such as roughly the period between the 12th and 14th century. We see a rise of interpretations that connect the interpretation of this oath to the history of prophets. For example, in Ibn Taymiyyah, you can see that he says, and he's really the last in a row of people who did that. He says, At-Tin wa Zaytun relates to the Holy Land, so this is Jesus. Tur Sinin is obviously Moses, and Hadal Balad is Al-Amin is Muhammad. And then he also sees the logic to the order of these, because it's not the chronological order, because Jesus didn't come before Moses, but it's the order of proximity to God's true revelation. So the Bible is the furthest away, and then comes like the Torah, and then comes the Quran. So which is kind of, it's an obvious move on his part, because this entire interpretation occurs in a polemic against the Christians, like this, 5-volume al-Jawab as-Sahih. So obviously he wants to put down the Christians, and he's not that concerned with the Jews, but it also, of course, fits this order, and then he connects it with something in the Bible and so on. It's very interesting, but what I'm actually getting at here is Muhammad Abdu, who says, in his Tafsir Juz Amma, which is a short commentary on the 30th part of the Quran that was intended to be used as a school book and is completely understudied. So everybody is always talking about the Tafsir al-Manar, and nobody has ever really done a study on the Tafsir Juz Amma, and it's on my long list of things I would like to do if I had the time or something, so maybe I will at some point. So what he says here is, it might be likely that they denote the two types of trees, so the fig and the olive. Obviously it's what's most contested here, but not because of their beneficial properties, as the exegetes have said, rather because they call to mind great and important events that have left a lasting impression upon human affairs. God wants to remind us of 4 chapters in the long book of the history of mankind, from its first origins to the time of the Prophet Muhammad's mission. So then he says, a teen is a reference to the story of Adam and Eve, because they were covering themselves with fig leaves, and then a zaytun is a reference to Noah, because of the olive branch that the dove had in its beak when it came back to the ship, to the ark. And here you already see this is not actually Quranic material. It's not even really material from the Muslim tradition on these stories. It's material from the Bible. So he was reading the Bible in order to interpret the Quran, which is one thing that is very interesting about this. And then he says Moses and Muhammad. And then he also says he sees history as a kind of progression towards the end, where men do what they have been created to do by God, namely use their reason to improve human societies, etc. And periodically they fail and they are punished by God, or whatever, something bad happens to them, he isn't that clear on it, and then it starts again. So it's a strange and interesting mix between a kind of cyclical idea of history that is, he was very impressed by Ibn Khaldun, so a lot of the things he writes are very reminiscent of that, but at the same time it's also very 19th century European idea of history as something that has a progression and a purpose. And also that he thinks about mainly in terms of society. So it's about humans and the society they build. And then, yeah, God is there, definitely, and God has, but God's main role is to establish some rules for which humans should follow in order to develop this society, basically mostly use their reason and their, intellectual facilities. And if they fail to do so, God has made the world in a way that means this kind of society will fail. So this is what he also called the sunan Allah, the habits or the customs of God in dealing with humans. So you have a very strong interest in history, but of course this is not history in the sense of historicity, because the story of Adam and Eve and the fig leaves is, it's salvific history, but it's not something that you could kind of prove or research or examine with any historical means. There's no extra religious evidence for it. And this is also not his point, because it's mainly a story that is supposed to have a moral. But nevertheless, we see the start of something in this period that brings, for example, forth exegetes with a strong interest in biblical archaeology, in Quranic chronology, textual coherence, and many other perspectives that have a bearing on whether to use the Quran as a historical text and how to do so. And my idea is really, and this comes from looking at other verses again that I'm going not into here, but you can really see this historical and social turn even in Salafi exegetes, for example, who would completely deny that they are doing any such thing. but in actual fact they are doing it all the time, because the question that really rose for me, and I'm going to come back to that in the end, is whether it's even possible today to read the Quran in a way that completely gets rid of this kind of thought in terms of, you know, human society, and just go back to a framework where it's exclusively about individual salvation. I assume it would be very hard to do. So just a very quick, I try to think about, from all my study of modern tafsir, in what ways historical sources and historical contexts come up in modern tafsir. And what I'm talking about here is really applied exegesis. So I'm not talking about hermeneutical theory, because that would probably take the rest of the week or something, and it's also not my field. I'm really talking about, I don't know, interpretation of actual verses in the actual Quran, with a focus on complete works of tafsir, but not an exclusive focus. And this is kind of important, because I have the feeling that there's a lot more advanced and daring and complex and intellectually rigorous hermeneutical theory than there's actual exegesis. And this is sometimes a bit frustrating, because I read this theory and I think, okay, but please do something with it. What do you do with it? Show me. So, yeah. So when we look at these works of applied tafsir, first of all, what we find is, of course, a very strong interest in historical semantics. And this is probably the most widespread and a very useful method, and one that's often relatively easy to apply. And of course, it has a lot of proponents, Muslim, non-Muslim, like Toshihiko Izutsu and Fazlur Rahman, and so on. So one example that also shows why this method is very often favored by modernist interpreters is the interpretation of the term Islam. Inna dina indallahi al-Islam. This is not the entire verse, but it's usually the part it's the part that's important here. So obviously you can read this as meaning that the only religion that God will accept is Islam, in the sense of, you know, following the teachings of Muhammad and praying 5 times a day, etc., etc., professing the Shahada and so on. Or you can read it in the sense that the only religion is submission to God, which is a far more inclusive reading and could include all kinds of people, depending on your interpretation then of what submission to God actually means. Then another thing that comes up very often is, again, Fazlur Rahman, the double movement theory. So the idea is, so this is mostly about applying the teachings of the Quran to specific problems. So the idea is to go back towards the Quranic context, so the context in which the Quran was revealed, and see what particular problem was this verse actually trying to address. And then from this you can take an idea of what the impetus or the motive of the verse actually was, the higher aim, and then you can go back to the present period and see what's our problem now and how do we apply this higher aim to it. So then you get away from having to apply the specifics of the verse, and you can move to a different type of application, which means that it's also particularly popular with modernists. And one obvious example, and the one that tends to come up all the time when people talk about modern interpretation of the Quran, is Quran 434. And I'm definitely not going into the entire debate on this, just as an example. So the question here is basically, when this verse says, or seems to say, that the husband is allowed to hit his wife, does this mean the husband has to hit his wife, or does it at least mean he is allowed to, even today? Or should we look at the aim of the verse in the historical period, and then you could postulate that this was actually a time when husbands could do whatever to their wives, they could beat them to death or whatever. So this was actually, the verse said, no, first you have there's actually something missing in the translation. So it says you admonish them, and then you shun them in their beds, and only if that doesn't work, which by the way is also contested if the verse actually means that, but only if that doesn't work you can hit them. So it's a last resort. and it's actually trying to limit the power of husbands over their wives, and so maybe you should take that intent and then transfer it to the modern period. This has also been criticized by, for example, Mahmud Pachaji, a Turkish theologian, has criticized Fazlur Rahman by saying this completely doesn't take into account the perspective of the subjective perspective of the person who is actually doing the movement and judging like what the problem was historically, what the problem is today, etc. And this can cause all kinds of problems. So first of all, how can we really be sure that we know the historical context? And this is one problem, because very often in this type of exegesis it's just assumed. But where do we actually take this from? I mean, do we have the detailed knowledge on Jahiliyyah marriage customs? I'm not sure we do. I'm not really an expert for this, but what I'm relatively sure of is that in most interpretations of Quran 434 that I've read, this is just postulated. It's not actually shown. And this is a big problem with this kind of approach. And the other criticism is that it also assumes that we have a kind of objective grasp of our current situation, starting with the assumption that it's like one situation that's the same for all Muslims living today, and that kind of has an objective solution or something. Okay, so then something that has become very popular is, and I'm just going to run through it, but is Tafsir in the order. How much time do you have left? Okay, so Tafsir in the order of revelation. This is very interesting. And actually, the first example I found was from 1911 in East Bengal. And this was a guy who did a PhD in Sanskrit in Berlin and got to know Theodor Nölleke, so this is really interesting. But it basically took off with Muhammad Izzat Darwaza in the 1960s, a Palestinian exegete, and then it became really popular when the Moroccan philosopher, exegete Muhammad Abd al-Jabiri did it in around 2010, sorry. And then it became a big thing in Turkey for a while, and a lot of Quran translations in the order of revelation were published. The problem here is that very often chronology is not really problematized, so it's just taken for granted that we know the chronology, or exegetes come up with their own chronology based on some model, and then they change some surahs around, but usually it seems a bit arbitrary. And also when you look at al-Jabari's treatment, I think it's a potentially very powerful method, but what he does is mainly piety, which is fine. It's just probably not what is usually meant when it is said that Muslims are applying the historical context to the interpretation of the Quran. So for him it's mainly reading the Sīra through the Quran and the other way around, and increasing belief in both of them. Like mainly it's supposed to cause the reader to be amazed at the Sīra and the Quran even more than they were before, or something like that. So I think maybe potentially in the future exegetes will be able to do more with this method, but one of the problems is really chronology, because I mean, it is a helpful concept, I think, personally, but it also, if you get to the details, a lot of things are very fuzzy about it, and it would be unwise to pretend that we have like the definite chronology that is going to answer all our questions about the history of the Quran, and I'm not sure we are actually going to be able to get there. So we have, whoops, why is this changed? Anyway, so we have a general problem very often with chronological approaches, which is that on the one hand they are very popular with modernists, but at the same time these modernists are usually not that happy with a reading of the Quran where the Medinan verses trump the Meccan verses, which is what's mostly happening when you apply, for example, the classical concept of Nas. But the Medinan verses are where all the legislation takes place, where warfare takes place, etc. And of course there are lots of different ways of dealing with this, but one way would be what Mahmud Muhammad Taha, for example, proposed by just reversing the Meccan and Medinan period in their prioritization. So by saying like the Meccan period actually brought the universals, and the Medinan period just brought the particulars that were relevant to the 7th century. So if we want to have an Islam that's, what God actually meant for us to engage with in our age, we have to go back to the Meccan Islam. This again is potentially very powerful. In the specific case of Mahmud Muhammad Taha, the problem was a bit that he had no coherent or clear concept of chronology. It was more like circular reasoning. So everything he found in the Quran that he wanted to be valid today was by definition Meccan, and the other way around. And this is, of course, not a very, convincing way of dealing with this. One way out of some of the dilemmas that has been tried is Quranism, or which might also be done by doing something that Sahib Said is going to publish a book on very soon, which I recommend to anyone who is interested, on Tafsir al-Qur'ān bil-Qur'an. And taken to its extreme, this method can yield some interesting results. I'm not going to go into that for reasons of time, but I've worked a bit on the case study of this guy who actually did, it was mostly TV tafsir, Hassan ibn Farhan al-Maliki, a Saudi intellectual, a very, very interesting person who delivers a commentary on the Fatiha, and especially on the last verse of the Fatiha, where he tries to draw the interpretation exclusively from the Quran. So you can see he has a lot of Quranic cross-references, for example, Alladhina an'amta alayhim, who are they? So some simplistic people say it's the Muslims, but if we look at the Quran, we can see it's not the Muslim, because the Quran uses this expression in other places, and also the Quran talks about like al-maghdubi alayhim, not just with respect to the people of the book, but also with respect to, for example, certain groups of Muslims, and also not with respect to all the people of the book, so it's obviously not a Muslim versus non-Muslim things, and so on. The interesting thing about him is that he takes this so far that he practically gets rid of all the Sunnism. So he moved away from considering himself a Sunni. He also didn't become a Shi'i. He basically said that even in the last years of the Prophet's life, the Quran and its interpretation became so politicized, and different groups tried to raise claims to it and to its meaning, and this was very unfortunate, and it became a very political text. And so he described his own approach as Shi'at al-Qur'an. He's, as far as I'm aware, he's now in jail in Saudi Arabia, so it's probably not that surprising. Okay. So and the question that comes up here is it even possible, I mean, is anybody really succeeding in taking the Quran away from all its historical context? Probably not. I mean, even the Quranists pray according to some ritual that's not described in the Quran in detail and stuff like that. So it's kind of obvious that there's something in there. There are actually some interesting writings by Turkish Alevis who are trying to make the case that precisely because prayer isn't described in that much detail in the Quran, it's actually their way of praying, which is not 5 times a day, etc. That's more Quranic than what the Sunnis are doing. Which is kind of an interesting experiment, actually, because it could cause one to think about what role does the Quran have, and what else do you need, actually, to come up with the kind of Islam that you personally want to live and that you stand for. I don't have any personal preference or opinion on this, it's just observations. One last observation is that I think, I've pointed to a lot of things where I'm saying like, okay, I don't find this and that and so on satisfactory, and I hope this doesn't come across as condescending, because I don't mean it that way. I think there are actually many opportunities in all these things, and one of the reasons for which they haven't been taken as far as I think they could is that modern Muslim discourses seem to me to be very often trapped in apologetics. So it's very often kind of, there's this convoluted involvement with what others have said about us, which we have to refute, what others think about us, what we don't want to be, what we don't want to believe, etc. Like, we don't want historical critical because that's what the Christians say we do. And okay, so then I'm not saying you need to do historical critical exegesis or anything, but I had very interesting discussions about this with some younger colleagues from the Indonesian context who felt really a bit trapped by this. They really said, so on the one hand they are like, working in a system where you're constantly required to cite all the Western sources and so on. And on the other hand, they feel kind of uncomfortable with this. They feel like it's kind of colonial. On the other hand, they also realistically know that you can't just go back to some perceived golden age whenever that might have been and pretend that all the rest hasn't happened. It's just life doesn't work that way. So basically, there will just have to be some way forward out of this, and what we need, I think, is careful, detailed studies of specific problems, very specific problems that are aware of the possibilities and also of the limitations of the historical sources we have, because many of these problems are ultimately due to the fact that we simply don't know. It's not bad will on anyone's part or something. We sometimes just don't have the sources. Maybe we will have them at some point, maybe we won't. And in that case, in the latter case, we have to deal with it some way. These sources include the tradition of tafsir without necessarily always uncritically subscribing to it, but also without dismissing it out of hand like as irrelevant. I think we have a lot of these studies already in some fields, for example, the whole warfare, allies, enemies, kind of semantics thing. There's quite a bit going on in that area. In other areas, it seems to be, to me, to be more problematic. You can see that a bit in the book by Aisha Hidayatullah, who tried to do a PhD on feminist approaches to the Qur'an, and who started out with being very optimistic about them and ended with being very pessimistic about them, and it's kind of like she seems to be a bit at a loss of how to move forward from there. And I think this is really because this particular field is involved in so many apologetics, but also practical and political and social problems. So much defensiveness going on that it's probably very hard to approach it like from a fresh perspective. But I think this is ultimately what's going to move us forward. So not the big theories, which are then very hard to put into practice, but really the small detailed studies. And I think the evolution, like the emergence of Islamic theology in Germany, is really one place where I'm very hopeful that interesting things are going to happen. So I'm looking forward to seeing what my colleagues here are going to do in the coming years. Thank you.